Listeners might remember a couple of weeks back, it was the weekend of around the 8th of June. We were discussing the fact that in Dublin Archdiocese, Archbishop Diarmuid Martin had ordained 8 men to what was called the permanent diaconate. And at the time we said we'd come back and we'd discuss it, but of course we've had the whole excitement of Congress since. So this week we're joined by Br Martin Browne. Martin is a monk of Glynstall Abbey. He also happens to be the headmaster of the school for the boys. And he also happens to be a permanent deacon. Morning, Martin, and welcome to the programme.
Hello, Shane and John. Nice to be with you both.
Good morning, Martin.
Now, people might be wondering why the voice is familiar, because for those of our listeners who were watching the Mass for Pentecost from Glynstall Abbey, they might recognise Martin's voice, because Martin was the deacon that read the Gospel and preached at it. Martin,
guilty as charged.
Now, Martin, you're a monk of Glynstall. How long have you been in Glynstall?
I joined the community in September 2001, so
right.
Nearly 11 years here now.
Wow, 11 years. And you also happen to be what's called a permanent deacon.
Indeed.
Now, people are going to ask, what is a permanent deacon? And we're kind of hoping that you're going to be able to give us some insight to it on the program.
I'll do my level best. Well,
the first thing I suppose is, what is a deacon?
What is a deacon? Well, a deacon is a minister of the church. He's an ordained minister of the church. Anybody who would have been looking at either of the broadcast masses during the Eucharistic Congress at either end would have seen that there were 2 men on either side of the main celebrant at each mass who were vested slightly differently. Well, that's because they were deacons. So deacons initially were assistants to the apostles. If you look at the Acts of the Apostles in, I think, chapter 6, the apostles needed some help in feeding the widows and orphans, and so they laid hands on 7 men. And these men are seen as the first deacons. So they were. So since then, assistants to the apostles become sort of assistants to the bishops. So they have a very close link with the bishop always. But they're ordained ministers of the church. The word deacon comes from the Greek diakonos or diakonos. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, which is the Greek word for servant. And so the deacon is an ordained servant to some extent. That's not to say that priests or bishops aren't servants too. They clearly are supposed to be, as indeed is any baptized Christian in many ways. But the deacon is a sort of a public expression of the servant nature of the church, would be one way of describing who a deacon is. It's very easy to get sort of caught up in what a deacon does or what a deacon can and can't do. But who or what a deacon is a slightly more complex question to answer, and that gives some sense of what a deacon is supposed to be.
Right. And in terms of this thing, permanent deacon, what's the permanent bit about it, I suppose?
Right. You mightn't, or not everyone might realise it, but every priest who is ordained priest is ordained deacon probably about a year or so before his ordained priest. And so for a long part of the many centuries of the church's history, deacons and the diaconate were seen merely as a sort of a stepping stone. You were ordained deacon and then you were ordained priest shortly afterwards, sometimes very shortly afterwards. In the current day and age, it's normally about a year. And so to a lot of people, if they happen to be in a parish where a deacon served for a couple of weeks, maybe as part of a placement from seminary, they would have seen deacons as almost apprentice priests, or half-baked priests. The patron saint, one of the patron saints of deacons, was one of the early deacons of the church, St. Lawrence, who was martyred by being cooked on a griddle, and he's alleged to have said to his tormentors at one point, "I'm done on this side, turn me over." Well, some people think that and he was a deacon. Some people tend to think that the deacons are priests who've been only cooked on one side and they need to be cooked on the other side to make them into priests. So, in the history of the church in Ireland, the only kind of deacons that we have seen until recently have been those kind of deacons, guys who are preparing to be ordained priest and serve as deacon for a year or so. So obviously,
of course, the important thing, of course, to bring across is the fact that even though different terms are used between permanent and transitional deacons, it's all deacons. They're all the same deacons.
a deacon is a deacon is a deacon. There's only one way of ordaining a deacon.
Right.
The rite isn't any different. So obviously permanent means permanent. So a permanent deacon is somebody who chooses or is chosen to remain a deacon, and so has no plans, or it is not envisaged that he will in time become a priest. So that's what's distinctive. In fact, in some parts of the world, in some other denominations, I know the Church of England refers to the distinctive diaconate, which might be a better way of describing it. So people who are ordained deacons as deacons, not as a
step on the way.
Yeah.
It's interesting now that you, of course, as a monk, obviously the issue of getting married doesn't arise for you as such. But can permanent deacons get married? Because it was something I suppose that a lot of people were curious about.
Well, you have to be very careful how you answer that question.
Right.
Deacons can't get married or may not get married, but married men may become deacons.
Okay.
So now, see, can I spell that out a little bit more clearly? Obviously, those who are to be ordained priests in the current discipline of the Latin Church must commit to celibacy. Someone like me who's already in religious vows as a monk is already vowed to celibacy, so the question doesn't arise, as you say. But these people who were ordained by Archbishop Martin in Dublin a few weeks ago, I think most of them, I think 7 out of the 8, I think, somebody told me, are married. So married men may be ordained deacon. And in practice, most permanent deacons in the world are married men.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned about most deacons in the world. Like, this is something that has become very popular since the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah. We're a little bit late and a little bit breathless in Ireland catching up. But the fact is that the Second Vatican Council, way back in the 1960s, decreed in its constitution on the Church, document Lumen Gentium, that the diaconate was to be restored as a permanent order of ministry in the Church.
40 years, 50 years later, we're catching up.
Yeah. So shortly after that, the Church began regulating how that should happen, and Rome produced a kind of a directory, a set of instructions on how deacons should be formed and so forth. But it was left up to each country, to the bishops' conference in each country, to decide if and when it would introduce the permanent diaconate. So if anybody who has been visiting America has been and gone to Mass in America, they'll be very used to deacons being present. There are tens of thousands of deacons in America. Most of the deacons in the world are in the United States. There are deacons in most English dioceses, but I think maybe not all. And it was only in 2006 that the Irish bishops decided to publish their directory and norms for the permanent diaconate. So it was only in 2006 that they indicated they were going to introduce permanent deacons, and it obviously took a few years then for programs to be set up, for training to be set up. And so what we saw 2 weeks ago in Dublin was the first batch of men ordained according to that, as a result of that decision in 2006. But yes, there are lots and tens of thousands of deacons around the world, but they're still considered, not considered, they are quite a rare thing in Ireland. But just to get back to what I was saying there a moment ago about married men may be ordained deacons, but deacons may not marry. Once you're ordained, you may not marry, and indeed a married deacon who becomes widowed may not remarry.
All right.
Yes, okay, I heard that.
And even a man who is being ordained deacon as a permanent deacon but is not married at the time of ordination, he must take the promise of celibacy then too. So once you're ordained, the possibility of getting married doesn't exist for the person anymore.
Martin, can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Why did you decide just to stay, I don't mean that facetiously,
I know what you mean.
Why did you choose to become a permanent deacon rather than continue on to priesthood?
Well, there were several reasons, some very personal and some kind of practical. I'll try and share some of them with you. One, I'd always been just intrigued by the idea that this had been restored by the Vatican Council, one of the great moments of reform and renewal in the Church, but it hadn't happened in Ireland. And one of because some people do tend to see deacons as sort of, as I say, I was being a little bit sarcastic, but about kind of half-baked.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people do see deacons that way, they're often seen in some places as a sort of a response to the shortage of priests.
Yes.
And that is why I presume the Irish bishops took so long to approve the permanent diaconate, which I think is to be regretted.
Yes.
That the council thought that the diaconate is distinctive in its own right. It has something particular to do.
Yes.
It embodies something particularly in itself, independent of whatever functions or roles it can do. But because the Irish bishops chose not to introduce the permanent diaconate until we got to the stage where lots and lots of parishes were being either merged or clustered or not having resident priests. It does begin to. It looks a bit like they are being seen and used purely for their function as sort of replacements, as the next best thing to a priest. And I wanted to see, and because there's no shortage of priests in this monastery, thanks be to God, I wanted to see what a deacon can be. And what a deacon can embody when he isn't just running around covering jobs that there aren't enough priests to do.
Okay.
If you get me. So that was part of it. A second part of it was a very personal thing in that I spent a number of years studying theology in England, in Durham, and I was studying I spent some time actually in a seminary for Evangelical Church of England and Evangelical Methodist student ministers. And obviously the whole question of being able to share the Eucharist with other Christians is a very fraught one. We're not able to do that, and I felt that in studying alongside people who are training for ministry, the ministry of the Word, a deacon who proclaims the gospel and preaches but doesn't celebrate the Eucharist, that ministry sat more easily for me in my own personal context of having lived and studied and prayed alongside trainee ministers from other churches, but being unable to celebrate the Eucharist together. So the idea of having the moment of the ceremony where the bishop hands you the book of the Gospels,
yes,
that's easier for me to digest in myself than it is for him to be handing me the chalice and paten, because the way the level of division between the churches at the moment, I didn't feel particularly drawn to be the one who presides at the Eucharist. Now, obviously, somebody has to, and it's not that I'm fasting the Eucharist or anything like that. But just personally, I found it easier to get my head around being a minister of the church who doesn't celebrate the Eucharist.
Could I follow that through, please? And thank you for sharing that. Could I follow that through by asking you, if you so decided, could you be ordained a priest, or are you permanent deacon? That's it.
Sorry, not entirely clear. There'd be ways around it.
Okay.
Obviously, someone in my situation who is already committed to celibacy and doesn't have a wife and children, it might be a little bit simpler if that were to be decided at some point in the future. But it's the way the church has set up the structures around the permanent diaconate, it doesn't envisage that sort of a thing is meant to be exceptional.
Okay.
It's not meant to be kind of keeping your options open and seeing do you feel like it in a couple of years'
I accept
time.
that. Thanks for that.
Martin, going back to what you were saying about deacon being service, I suppose people will say, well, what does, and although we're trying not to bound by, I suppose, the job or the task, but I suppose people will be saying, well, what does a deacon actually do?
Well, that's a very reasonable question. And as I say, I react a little bit against an overemphasis on it, but obviously it's a question that needs to be asked because, yes, people need to know what a deacon does. Well, as I say, the deacon is a minister he's ordained to service and to charity and as a minister of the Word. So the deacon, whenever a deacon is present at Mass, it is the deacon who proclaims the gospel. He may preach if he's so designated to do so by the priest or the bishop. Deacons celebrate some sacraments, but I think that's actually a relatively modern innovation. Deacons in the Eastern churches wouldn't, for instance, carry out baptisms or perform weddings. Catholic deacons may and do quite often, and in a lot of parishes, again in the States, a lot of the baptisms will be done by the deacon. The deacon might do part of the funeral ceremony, might do the reception of remains the night before, and then the priest celebrate the funeral mass. So deacons, they proclaim and preach the gospel. They assist at the altar. As I say, there was always two deacons beside the bishop at those liturgies we saw on the television over the last 2 weekends. They assist at the altar. They distribute Holy Communion. Now, obviously, that's not particularly remarkable nowadays, in that lots of people distribute Holy Communion. And that's actually one of the things that is a little bit of a paradox, in that some people could say, well, what can you do that a layman can't do? And in some senses, there's very little.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I was saying a lot of it is actually about who the person is, or what it means to be a deacon, rather than what one can do. I have something here in front of me that I actually had printed in the booklet the day of my ordination, and it's from a homily preached, believe it or not, by a Church of England bishop way back in 1977 at the ordination of Rowan Williams, the current Archbishop of Canterbury. When Rowan Williams was being ordained deacon, again, a transitional deacon on the way to being a priest, the bishop who ordained him, as part of his homily, these few lines were part of his homily, and I think they're very powerful. He says, "The deacon is one who waits. He's never in charge. He is the servant of others, of God, of his bishop, and of the congregation. He is a voice. It is his task to read the Lord's gospel, not his own. He is a servant. It is his task to wait at the Lord's table. It is others who preside. He is the waiter, the attendant. Is there anything at all that is peculiar to the deacon? Is he given powers that are given to no one else? The answer is no. There's nothing he can do which nobody else can do, but that is just what's distinctive about him. He has no power. He is a servant. He's entrusted with the ministry of Christ, who washes his servants' feet. He embodies the service of the Lord, who has made himself the servant of us all." So I think that's a very accurate and
yes,
quite moving vision of what a deacon is. Because if you ask what can you do that nobody else can do, well, the answer is nothing. If there are no deacons at Mass, the priest will read the Gospel. If there are no deacons at Mass, there are lots of lay people who will help with the distribution of Holy Communion. A lay person could just as easily lead a wake service in the church when the body is being received. So there's very few things that couldn't be done by somebody else. And that's why I think it's important that the deacon is seen not so much as what he can do, but who he is in the context of the way our church sees itself, which is our church is a church of local churches, each centred around the bishop with his deacons, his priests, his people. So it's not so much what can the deacon do, as what can the bishop, deacon, priests, and people do together, would be kind of my slightly more rhetorical answer to the question. But the practical one is, yes, preaching, baptizing, marrying, and then leading people in prayer. The deacon at Mass will often give kind of the instructions. He will give the dismissal at the end. He'll invite people to give the sign of peace. Now, they're obviously very ritual things. They're just kind of a moment. But they also evoke another part of what is meant to be the deacon's role, which is sort of to animate the liturgy, to kind of help people enter into the liturgy. So it's not just a ceremonial role of being the person who kind of shouts out, "Go in peace." But those little ritual things are reflections of part of the true ministry of the deacon, which is to be somewhere almost between the people and the priest, drawing the people to the altar and bringing the altar to the people. So because of the history of the church, it got kind of shriveled up to being something that was done by men for a couple of months on their way to the priesthood, and with very small little kind of ritual moments where they read the gospel and they said the dismissal, but they didn't do a whole lot else. And so the 40, 50 years since the diaconate has been restored have been a sort of a time of discovery, trying to figure out, and there's an enormous literature, and I have quite a lot of it here in my shelves, as to what the diaconate is and what it means, and what deacons should and shouldn't be doing, and how they should and shouldn't be behaving. And it hasn't been fixed yet. There's still a lot of contention and looseness around it. Because, 40, 50 years might seem like an awful long time, but but like dog years, in church years, that's not very long at all.
No, of course.